Good evening. I would like to tell you about Annette Snell's final journey aboard Southern Airways Flight 242 on April 4th, 1977. My name is Frederick Clemens, and I was a passenger on that same flight. In the last week of March 1977, Annette Snell was a rising R&B singer who traveled from her home in New York City to Muscle Shoals, Alabama. There she was to start work on her first album under a deal with Epic Records. Annette spent several days recording 4 songs at the Muscle Shoals Sound Studio. The studio's house band, the Swampers, was well known, having worked with major artists like Aretha Franklin and the Rolling Stones. Because the hotels in the area were booked up, she stayed at the home of Jimmy Johnson, one of the core members of the Swampers. Later, after wrapping up her sessions, Annette stayed the weekend in Muscle Shoals and asked Jimmy Johnson to book a flight for her back home, leaving on the afternoon of Monday, April 4th. When Monday came, a worker from the recording studio gave her a ride to the airport. The flight that was to start Annette on her trip home was Southern Airways Flight 242. Southern Airways was a small airline based in Atlanta that had been serving local airports in the southeast region of the country since 1949. It was one of several local service airlines that started up after World War II with twin-engine DC-3 propeller planes. In the late 60s, Southern had made the jump into the jet age with the DC-9, a modern aircraft with 2 tail-mounted jet engines designed for short to medium-range trips. The DC-9 model that was used for Flight 242 seated 100 passengers in a single-class cabin with 2 pilots up front in the cockpit and 2 flight attendants to serve the passengers in the back. Annette checked into Flight 242 as passenger number 8. 21 other passengers boarded with her in the light rain at the small Tri-Cities airport. There was no official seating chart, but it is likely that Annette took a seat in the mid-section of the plane. Annette was not flying directly to New York City. Southern Airways would be flying her to Atlanta for a connecting flight on another airline to New York. Before getting to Atlanta, the plane first would be stopping off at Huntsville, Alabama, where another 61 passengers would board and fill most of the remaining seats. It was at Huntsville that I boarded the plane. I was a young soldier traveling home with 2 classmates from an Army training course at Redstone Arsenal. Taking into account the 2 Muscle Shoals passengers who deplaned at Huntsville to catch another flight, the total number of passengers aboard Flight 242 leaving out of Huntsville was 81. A strong weather front was moving from the west to the east through the southeastern states that warm spring day, and the ride on Southern 242 was expected to be bumpy. The crew had been flying back and forth through this weather all day, and so as a precaution, the pilots instructed the flight attendants to skip the beverage service that they normally would have given on this quick 25-minute hop over to Atlanta. The mid-afternoon climb out from the Huntsville airport was mildly rough as we passed through the low-hanging clouds, but then things smoothed out as the plane leveled off and we got used to the usual sensations of flying in a big jet. What Annette, I, and the other passengers didn't know was that we were chasing after the squall line of the weather front, and when we caught up to it, the feel of the ride would change dramatically. The pilots, on the other hand, saw the big picture of the storm ahead and were working to find a route through it that would avoid the roughest patches. Through a combination of miscommunications and unlucky decisions, Southern 242 ended up penetrating the very worst of the storm front. Our route passed through a thunderstorm cell that had the highest rating of severity. In the cabin, we experienced a sudden darkness as we entered the thunderstorm. There we were met by turbulence, heavy rain, and flashes of lightning. At the thunderstorm center, we ran into a wall of hailstones, some as large as baseballs. They hammered the plane, cracking the front windshield and causing a flame out of both engines. This also meant that we lost electrical power. With the sudden loss of the cabin lights in the dark cloud, we passengers were acutely aware that our situation was now an emergency. This awareness was compounded by the backfiring of the engines as the pilots unsuccessfully attempted to restart them. Our modern jetliner was suddenly transformed into a powerless glider, and the question now was, where would we land? Although the cockpit was too busy focusing on that question to make any announcements to us in the cabin, our flight attendants did a remarkable job on their own initiative preparing us for an emergency landing. But they themselves were just as clueless as we were about where the landing might happen. After our preparations were completed, we were left contemplating what our fates would be in the next few minutes. Running out of altitude and too far from the airport, the pilots chose a 2-lane country road as the best surface on which to set down the heavy plane. As they banked left to line up with the road, we passengers finally got a view of where we were headed, a sparsely settled area of pine trees and rolling hills. We were then directed to keep our heads down for the final approach. The pilots succeeded in touching down on the center line of the road, but the wings were just too wide to avoid hitting obstacles on both sides. The plane veered off to the left and was rapidly torn apart while moving at a speed of over 100 miles per hour. The violence of the breakup cost the lives of 3/4 of the people aboard the plane, including Annette, as well as that of several local residents of a small community called New Hope, Georgia. In the immediate aftermath of the crash and the anniversary since, Annette's name and story have frequently come up as a tragic example of the lives lost and dreams ended. Most recently, at the 40th anniversary memorial celebration in New Hope, one of Annette's recordings was played as a tribute and a consolation for the grieving attendees. The story of Southern 242 will forever be entwined with the tragedy of an R&B singer whose life was abruptly ended just as her career was beginning a new phase.